Okay, so in my last video where I spoke to my anti-natalist views, more specifically my effectively altruistic, child-centered anti-natalist views, meaning specifically, I don't believe in bringing children into this world for moral reasons, but I believe in focusing on the needs of existing children. All of this I wish went without saying, but unfortunately it doesn't. Right, so in my last video on this, I said I don't want to make another video speaking about my anti-natalist views, because my anti-natalist argument is essentially 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right, provided you assume the axioms of piano arithmetic and non-modular, ordinary base 10, just arithmetic, right? Like, in other words, 2 plus 2 equals whatever you want it to be, provided you establish axioms and then are logically consistent with those. That's just the consensus mathematical view of arithmetic, right? But in the ordinary arithmetical context that most people are familiar with, 2 plus 2 undeniably equals 4, and anyone who doesn't realize that in general cannot be convinced otherwise. Like, there is, in other words, it's not like there's a counter argument within ordinary arithmetical axiomatic presuppositions for 2 plus 2 equaling anything other than 4. Like, okay. I hate that I have to say this, right? Because the folky way to denounce irrationality is to be like, oh, you're saying 2 plus 2 equals 5. Right? But in reality, you can create a system where 2 plus 2 equals 5, which equals anything else. Right? Like 2 plus 2 in mod 1 equals 5 in mod 1, which equals 0. Which equals 2 plus 2 in mod 2. Anyway, the point is just like, if you're a mathematician claiming otherwise, you're not a mathematician. That's just all it is. So wasting your breath trying to argue with such people, it's true, as Thomas Paine said, that you should just walk away, right? But you can't always walk away. We're trapped on planet Earth with each other, right? If I could leave planet Earth and go somewhere other than, Mars, like ideally another Earth-like planet that already existed and was ideally not inhabited by human being-like creatures, or anyway, you can't just walk away from irrationality, can you? We're trapped. Oh boy. Anyway, but I figured I should speak to the idea of steelman-ing the counter-argument, right? Because in general, there is no logically coherent natalist argument, right? I have a video on why natalism is fundamentalism, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is that there is no, legitimate... Sometimes you have a legitimate debate where there are two interpretations of a situation that are both internally consistent, right? And it's just not clear which one you should assume because they both seem to be viable. There's the best example of this, in my opinion, or that I'm aware of, is a mathematical debate between, what would you call, basically like finitism, that might be called, or intuitionism, versus the Cantorian orthodox view now of set theory that accepts the Cantorian infinity axioms, right? Which means what? Like, some people think that you shouldn't, that Cantor's idea of transfinite numbers doesn't make sense because infinity is in fact incomprehensible, and that, the classic contemporary example of such a person is Norman Wildberger, who I personally love, even though I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but he has a legitimate argument. He makes legitimate points. He's not always right, but this is a legitimate position to assume in a debate that is still relevant, right? And the counter-argument position is also relevant. So, like, him debating this issue with another mathematician who is versed in the history and the relevant, bullet points is a debate worth listening to. Right? But natalism versus anti-natalism, from my perspective, is an extremely boring debate. Like, it's the anti-natalist saying 2 + 2 = 4, and then the other person just being basically a religious zealot who says, my argument is right just because it is. Right? So, but I have been studying and benefiting a great deal from studying, broadly speaking, indigenous spirituality and philosophy and culture, which is an extremely broad category. So, like, more specifically, Anishinaabe philosophy, spirituality, culture, which is itself extremely broad. So, like, more specifically within that, Ojibwe philosophy, spirituality, culture, and that is still extremely broad. Right? So I'm trying to focus it in as much as I can onto my region of the Michigan in particular, southeastern Michigan and so forth. But one thing that is common to, as far as I'm aware, almost all, if not all, indigenous worldviews is natalism, right? Like, I'm not aware of any of these people making the anti-natalist argument that I make. Right, so there's, even though I agree fundamentally with so many aspects of, in particular, like, what I understand to be, in general, the Ojibwe worldview, although, again, it's like, it's a very free inquiry focused worldview. Like, you're still encouraged to think for yourself and to come up with your own, this is not a conformist system. That's one of the things I love about it. But anyway, the reason I mention that is I respect these systems. There are two things I disagree with these, what I've heard people say, and it's two things: natalism and the idea of respecting your elders. Okay, I believe in loving your elders, taking care of your elders, and listening to your elders. I have no problem with that. But when your elders say things like, black people are inferior to white people, like my elders, okay, that's not worth respecting. Like, you should not respect them when they say such things. Or if they say 2 + 2 = 5, you should not respect that. Right? It doesn't mean that arguing with them will necessarily accomplish anything, but that doesn't deserve respect. Okay, they still deserve love, patience, care, consideration, compassion, food, water, shelter, and you should listen to them, like, hear out what they have to say, even if it is hateful and absurd and so forth, because you can still learn a great deal. I have learned a great deal from my grandparents and my parents. I love them. I have tried to take care of them. Right? Like, but do I respect their worldview? No. In general, like, no. Just, like, flat out no. Anyway, I think I should try to steelman the natalist position. And a quick note on steelmanning. My instinct is to steelman my opponent in any argument whatsoever. But I, at the same time, have realized that this tactic in general doesn't work. In other words, you can do this all you want, but the likelihood that the opponent will, like, awaken as a result and be like, whoa, you understand my argument. You've articulated it just as well, if not better, than I have. And you have made your own point that is logically consistent with what you've said with my argument. My eyes are open. Now I understand the error of my ways. That just, like, hardly ever happens. And the whole point of steelmanning, from a tactical standpoint, should be to increase the likelihood that your opponent actually understands the error of their ways. But it just doesn't work. So what is the point in doing it? Well, in my opinion, it's just for yourself. It's just to make sure that you yourself understand your opponent's argument. You're just, like, checking in with your own thinking. That's all. So what, in my opinion, is the strongest version of the natalist position? It would have to be this. Say you are a victim of genocide, meaning you're still alive. You haven't yet been murdered, hopefully, by such a process, but your ancestors have, potentially, or like, this is a complicated position to consider, because ultimately all of our ancestors at one time or another have undergone some form of violent annihilation of some kind or another, right? So, like, but what I'm talking about in general, of course, is you have a recent, if not present, relationship with genocide. Okay, like, I would like to not have to name specific people, but let's say you are Palestinian in Gaza. Let's say you are an Ojibwe person here in Michigan. Let's say, you are in Rwanda or wherever it may be. You're a Jewish person, of course. You have a recent and present relationship with genocide. One of the things that most, if not all, of the people of those groups that I just mentioned that I've heard from, not all, but definitely most, people will say something of the sort that if you don't go on existing as a group, then your enemy wins, because your enemy's aim is to annihilate you from the face of the earth, to make you disappear. So if you stop having children, you will disappear, right? And then your enemy wins, right? Okay, so wrong, I would say, this is where I'm going with this, of course. No, that's not right. But that is at least psychologically the most reasonable thing that I can come up with as far as a reason to have children, is the idea that, like, someone who has gotten away with atrocious crimes would be happy as a consequence of you not having children, and why should you grant them that satisfaction? Right? Like, why should they get to go on living and having children, and their children have children, and you don't? When you know that the only reason for this is atrocious level injustice. Right? That makes psychological sense. However, it's still wrong. And here's why. They don't win. Right? The oppressors who get to go on living, they don't win. Because it turns out going on living in this world is not winning. Anyway, also committing genocide, put it this way, the people who commit genocide aren't winners. They're losers. Which sounds like an understatement, but I mean that the thing that they think is their reward is an illusion, right? So you might think things like, well, they win control over resources, or they win things like the presidency or political power. They win the ability to reproduce and therefore, in a biological sense, be fit, and therefore, like, succeed in a reproductive competition that is the underlying, only purpose of genetic reproduction. Anyway, none of these things are actually winning in any meaningful sense of the word. That's it. Like, once you understand, like, let's consider people who have already gone extinct, to make the point. So how many tribal nations, for example, have already gone extinct? Countlessly many, like, throughout the history of humanity. I don't know how many, but it's a lot. Okay, so how many of the descendants of those people are still experiencing genocide? 0. How many of the descendants of those people are experiencing any suffering whatsoever? 0. Okay, so when I say things like, thankfully, the Ojibwe people still exist, because I am profoundly thankful that they still exist. What am I saying? I'm really saying that selfishly, I'm glad that they still exist, because they're incredible people, generally speaking, and their culture and worldview is incredible to me, and they protect the earth that I live on, so that's to my benefit. And from a moral perspective, I want to advocate for land reparations and justice, just because it's the right thing to do from a mathematical perspective. It's just like, you just don't want to let such crimes go unacknowledged. That's all it is. But also from a selfish perspective, if you live on planet Earth, you would rather that the people who protect the Earth be in charge, as opposed to the people who are insane, hateful imbeciles who are destroying everything without any accountability whatsoever and without any willingness to take any responsibility whatsoever. They're insane. The kind of people who want these people to be in power are themselves, of course, insane. They're deeply unwell. So you should, in theory, want the people to be in power who will wield that power most effectively, in particular when it comes to protecting all of the resources that you need to live a way of life that makes any sense whatsoever, right? Because here we are alive, and we got to cope with that however we possibly can, and destroying everything and going insane until you're dead is a terrible way of going about that. So when I say I'm thankful that indigenous people still exist, I'm basically being selfish. I'm being honest, but I'm being selfish. And I would encourage everyone else to be selfish about this as well. Like, be more self-centered, but in a rational way. It's not that I don't care about my fellow human beings in general. I love all beings, period. Like, I deeply and genuinely care about the well-being of everyone. Right? I don't mean I'm self-centered in the sense that I want to prioritize my well-being above others. Not at all. What I mean is, my own suffering still matters to me. Like, I would rather suffer less. Wouldn't you? Like, that's... these things just go without saying, you would think, but they don't. Right? So it's a very simple argument, like, the best version of the natalist position that I can come up with is the idea that you don't want genocidal maniacs to quote-unquote win. Except they don't win. They're losers. You basically don't have to worry about that. You're not going to be here. And you're not going to be here anyway. That's the other thing about it. Like, you should care about children, absolutely, who will survive you. But you don't need to make new ones to care about the ones that are already here. And you know what would be an excellent thing for all of the indigenous people of the world to do, rather than... And I'm not telling anyone what to do, by the way. I don't believe in telling people what to do or how to think. I believe in being honest about my own perception and sharing it and listening and being humble to other people. But I don't believe in just, like, you should do this. I don't go for that. But my opinion, my perspective is that if indigenous people, instead of having children of their own, were to start caring for and teaching all of everyone else's children, right, which on this continent means primarily white people. Imagine if indigenous people were teaching all of these incredible things that they are teaching their own children to white people's children. Somehow. I know that that's a complicated statement, and like assuming that they would be even allowed to do that is a big assumption, but I mean, imagine that was happening. Okay, well, there goes white supremacy. Nipped it in the bud right there. Right, like that would be an incredibly helpful thing for the entire world. Because here's the thing: what happens when you're teaching? You're an Ojibwe mother, and you have children, and you're teaching them Ojibwe culture and philosophy and spirituality, and showing them loving, nurturing kindness and encouragement. And this is excellent stuff. Like, this is exactly what children need. But meanwhile, there's Elon Musk's little boy X. And there's Trump's little boy, Barron Trump, right? And there's all my white neighbors' children, and they're teaching them the same shit that we're currently dealing with. They're teaching them a bunch of bullshit. Hateful, nonsensical, irrational, useless, destructive things. So we'll still have to deal with that the next go around, right? Until white people stop having children, I guess. But, like, why wait? Right, there's a Buddhist saying that lazy people put things off, and, you should not do that. I agree. I identify as a Kalama Sutta Buddhist. I won't bother, the Kalama Sutta is the doctrine of free inquiry. It could also be called the doctrine of responsibility. It just means take responsibility for your own thinking and your own actions. Don't take responsibility for other people's thinking and other people's actions unless you are in a leadership position which demands exactly that of you, right? Which is exactly the failure of pretty much leaders at every level of society at this point. None of them are willing to take responsibility for their own thinking and actions, let alone the thinking and actions of the people that they are themselves responsible for. It's just absurd. Right? They're just terrible bosses, terrible leaders. Joko Willink wrote a book about radical responsibility. I think he's still saying a lot of irrational things about it, but he's saying some absolutely necessary things when it comes to, like, if you're in a leadership position, you better fucking own up, right? Like, take responsibility, not only for yourself, but for the thinking and actions of everyone that you're responsible for, because that's what a leader is. If you're too stressed out to do that, right? If you're too busy to do that, don't be a leader, because you will be a bad leader, and the consequences will be negative, not only for you, but for everyone that you're responsible for. It's very simple, and the perfect illustration of this, and it's horrifically tragic, but it would be the police chief. He is a chief. He's a freaking chief. And he's still not accepting responsibility, but the police chief, who was responsible for the inaction of 400 police officers at the Uvalde school shooting, whenever that was, I think it was 2 years ago now. It was one person, complete lack of responsibility, that caused more children than needed to die. Innocent, defenseless children were murdered, gunned down by another child who had lost his mind, of course, because no one bothered to care about him either. No one checked in with him. No one, when he bought guns, no one was like, hey, what's going on here? Nobody cared. And including the police chief, who is still to this day not accepting responsibility for the fact that he did nothing for like 2 hours, just literally sat there, in a stunned state of complete lack of training or preparation or responsibility or courage or anything. What a complete failure of a leader. And that is exactly what happens when those kinds of people who should not be leaders become leaders. Nobody who is unwilling to take responsibility, not only for themselves, but other people, should ever be in a leadership position. And yet what we have are people who are unwilling to take responsibility whatsoever. Right? I don't even need to give examples. I am not fixated on the president or any of his cohorts. They are absolutely, disastrous. But the disaster, to me, is more the power vacuum that was created for them to assume power within. That's always the disaster. And people are going to call it fascism, but I insist on calling it nihilism, right? There's a difference, in my view, between fascism and nihilism. Anyway, the point is, nihilism is more destructive. And ultimately, the natalist position is a position that is nihilistic. It needs to be pessimistic. There's a difference between pessimism and nihilism. The difference is nihilists don't care about anything, ultimately. And in particular, the suffering of children. The fact that, if you're increasing suffering and death, a nihilistic position would be to say, yeah, whatever, I don't care. Right? The pessimist position is to assume that existence is negative. It's not meaningless. There is a meaning. It's a negative meaning for human beings. Anyone who has to consciously experience suffering in the way that human beings do, that's negative. Existence, humanly speaking, is unilaterally negative. It is in the big picture, neutral, sure, but not for us. It isn't. Right? So a pessimistic perspective says suffering is obviously bad. There is a negative meaning, and the only good you can do is to limit the sustain and the scope of that suffering. And the best way, perhaps the only way, to ensure that is to not reproduce. That's it. Right? It's not only that anti-natalism is one thing that I believe, it is the central thing that I believe. Because if you're talking about what good can I do in the world, well, by good, what else do you mean other than limit suffering? Right? I'm a Buddhist, so that's just how I roll. I think suffering is bad, and I think harm reduction is the way to go. Other people try to claim other things, but from my perspective, those positions make no sense. It's just religious fanaticism. It's not a legitimate argument, right? So, the best way to eliminate your problems, or to solve your problems, is to not create problems in the first place. That's how it goes. Like, if you stop, I always say, stop abusing children and you've solved almost all your problems. Stop having children and you've solved all your problems. Okay, the end.